One of the reasons that people don't test is because testing can be very complex. You run into these roadblocks, it seems impossible to test what you were hoping to test, and you just give up. So you stop writing tests, or you just never even start. And the whole point of this section is to give you a real-world, practical way to test your React apps. And hopefully you found everything contained in here very useful. What we're going to do from here is explore some more complex stuff. So we have a lot of more complex components like expense form, for example. There is just a ton of stuff inside of here, and as soon as we start testing, we are going to run into roadblocks. So that's why we are going through this now. The whole point of the course is to get you past those roadblocks so you can actually move past them when you're testing your real React apps that you create on your own. So by testing just this one component, we're going to learn a whole lot about testing. There are quite a few hurdles we're going to have to overcome, but that's okay. We're going to move through the process together. So step one, we are going to create a new file for this in the tests directory, expenseform.test.js. No surprises there. And once we have that up and running, what we are going to do is make a quick change to expense form. So in here, we import the CSS for React dates, but we use React dates in other files, which can make this import really confusing. So what I'm going to do is just take it and shift it away from being in the expense form file. I'm going to cut it out, save this file, and I'm just going to put it inside of app.js where we currently have our other CSS imports. We'll worry about managing these in the next section where we actually talk about deployment. For now, I'm just going to shift it over here, save app.js, and close that down. We'll come back to our CSS a little bit later. So the goal is to start testing this component, and let's just start with the simplest test possible. We're going to start with one of our snapshot tests that just makes sure it renders correctly. So I can import React from React. I can import shallow from enzyme. And then I'm just going to grab the component itself. There is no connected version. Redux isn't used inside of here. So I can just grab the only thing we actually export, which is a default export. I'm going to import expense form from the following file up 2 directories to get into the source folder, into the components folder, and in there we have expense form.js. So we have all these imports in place, and now we can create our very simple test case. Yeah, I'm going to create one should render expense form correctly, and then I will set up the function for that test case. In here, we're going to do what we've done plenty of times before. I'm going to create a const wrapper. I'm going to call shallow, passing in the stuff I'm trying to render. And in this case, we're just going to render a single instance of expense form. Now, expense form does take an optional expense prop if we want to edit existing values. For now, though, let's just go ahead and leave that off using the default values. The rendering is in place, and now we can just actually create the snapshot. So I'm going to expect something about that wrapper. I'm going to expect it to match the existing snapshot. Now in the past, the first time we've ran our tests, it's always worked. And if we do that, we see the exact same thing. One snapshot written in one test suite. But we actually have a problem. The problem is that if we rerun the test suite, it's going to fail. So let's go ahead and do that. If we hit the W key, we can view some more options. And here we can hit enter to trigger a rerun. So I'm going to rerun the test suite, and we can see that the test we just set up is now failing. Right here, should render expense form correctly fails. And you can see what it's failing on. It's failing on the prop that we passed to single date picker. So the old date and the new date are different. This is causing an issue in the snapshot. So what exactly is going on? What's happening is that inside of expense form, right here, we are grabbing the moment at the current point in time. Now, obviously, every single time we run the test case, the point in time has changed, which is a pretty big problem for us. We need a way to consistently get the same data back right here without actually changing this. So how are we going to get that done? Because if we don't, we can't actually use a snapshot test like this one because the data is going to keep changing. The snapshot is never going to match the previous one. To fix this, we're actually going to be mocking out moment. So we're going to create a fake version of the moment library that is going to allow us to define what happens when the code actually calls this. And what are we going to do? We're just going to return a moment at a specific point in time. Now, this whole technique of mocking out third-party libraries can seem very strange at first, but I promise that once we are done this video, it'll make a lot more sense. So step one is to pull up the docs. Over here, if we go to the Jest documentation, we're no no longer going to be in the expect page. We're going to switch over to the manual mocks page. This is where we, the test writers, have the option to create mocks for various libraries. So right here, the example they use is a mock of the FS node module, FS standing for file system. What we're going to do is create a mock of the moment library. So step one is to create the mock, and Jest likes you to put that in your tests folder. We're going to go ahead and toss that right here in a new folder called __mocks__. So we have to stick to the exact same naming convention used for snapshots. Inside of here, we're going to be able to create the mocked version of the moment library. So we're going to create a file called moment.js. Now the goal is to define exactly what we want our mocked moment to look like. Then we'll actually be able to start the mocking over in the test file, and our snapshot will work as expected. So when we import moment, we expect something to come back on the default. And in this case, we expect it to be a function we can call. Sometimes we call it with nothing. Sometimes we pass in a value. And if we look at the other usages of moment down below, there are none. So we don't really have to worry about too much. All I'm going to do is add export default, and by default we are going to export an arrow function. So this is going to be the function that we call inside of the mocked moment library. So when I call this in the real application, it's actually going to use the moment library. When I call it in my test file, we're going to be using the mocked version of the library. And all I'm going to do is set things up like this. I'm going to ask for the timestamp argument, the first argument. If it exists, great, we'll use it. If not, we're going to set it to 0. And this is essentially going to allow us to time travel. It's going to make sure that if we are asking for the current point in time, it's a fixed point in time. Now that we have this in place, all we need to do is return an instance of moment at that point in time, timestamp. So this is going to make sure that functionality like this one, where we ask for a moment at a timestamp, still works, and it's also going to make sure that this one refers to a specific point in time, and that is going to allow our test cases to actually work. Now there's one discrepancy here. How do we get moment? We actually can't just import moment from moment in this file. This is going to look for the mocked version. So essentially we have a function that calls itself, and that's going to create a stack trace error. You're going to run down all the memory, and eventually the process is going to fail. What we want to do is grab the original version of moment, and Jest does give us a way to do that. If we scroll down through the list of examples and all of the various functions, the one we're looking for is this one, require actual. This is going to require the original module, not the mocked one. And that's what we're going to be doing right here. So we're going to remove this line and replace it. I am going to create a const called moment. I'm going to set it equal to require dot, and we're going to call that function we just looked at require actual. Then we're going to pass in the thing that is moment. So this is what we need to do inside of our Jest mock files in order to actually mock out a given library. Now that we have this in place though, we can actually save the moment mock file and see what happens. Now the first time this test case runs, we would still expect things to fail because the old snapshot was using the current time, and we've now switched that over. So if I do head to the terminal, we are indeed getting that, and this is okay. This is totally expected. What's important though is that if we hit U, after the test suite reruns, everything passes. So now our snapshot is always going to match because we've forced the moment to start at a specific point in time if no point in time was provided. And now we can actually add more snapshot tests to our application. Let's wrap this video up with an easy one. I want you to add a test for rendering expense form with the data. So we could add a title of should render expense form with expense data. So what you're going to do is render expense form, but you're going to pass in data from one of the fixtures. You can pick any of the 3. Then you're going to make a snapshot. And when you do make the snapshot, just take a quick glance over at the expense form snapshot file and make sure it looks reasonably correct. In this case, it's reasonably correct for our purposes because we had nothing. So I have an empty text area up above. I have an empty amount and an empty description as I would expect. So take some time to knock that one out, test your work, look at the snapshot, and when you're done, click play. All right, let's go ahead and kick that one off by importing something we need. We need the fixture data. So I'm going to import expenses. I'm going to grab that from up a directory. Inside of the fixtures folder, we have just one for expenses. Excellent. Now we can go ahead and write the test case. It's going to be so similar to this, so we can start with this as a little bit of boilerplate. Then we're going to change the title. Should render expense form correctly with expense data. There we go. That reads nicely. And then I'm going to pass in the property that expense form can take, which is expense. Now this gets set equal to the expense object. You could have used either of the 3 ones on our array. I'm going to access the second one. That would be expenses. We're going to grab the second item with the index of 1. Now that we have this in place, the last thing you needed to do was save your work and make sure the test actually passed. I also asked you to use enter to rerun the test suite, and here we can see that the test is indeed still passing. We have 8 snapshots showing up of 8 total. All are correct. If I do head over to the expense form snapshot file right here, I have the output for the first one. If I scroll down, now I have the output for the second one. So if we look at this one, I can see I do have the text here, rent. I have the value here. Down below, I do have the date, even though you didn't need to confirm this. Single date picker can be a little trickier to look at. And at the very bottom, text area is indeed empty, because if you remember, the fixtures data for that item did not have a note. So now that we have snapshots in place for this component, we're going to move on to more complex real-world scenarios, like actually running events. So changing inputs, doing things like submitting forms and clicking buttons. That is all coming up in the next video. This is where we're going to stop for now.